bell above McKenna's Antiques chimed with the brass clarity of genuine age as Sean Connery pushed through the heavy oak door on a gray Saturday afternoon in Edinburgh's Old Town. At 78, he had developed an appreciation for objects that had survived the test of time, finding comfort in the permanence of well-crafted things in a world increasingly obsessed with disposable convenience. The shop occupied 3 floors of a Georgian townhouse, its rooms filled with the accumulated treasures of centuries. Mahogany furniture that had witnessed countless family conversations, silver that had graced elegant dinners, books whose pages had been turned by hands long since returned to dust. Sean made his way slowly through the ground floor, pausing to examine a ship's compass that reminded him of his father's nautical interests, running his fingers along the spine of a leather-bound volume of Burns' poetry. "Can I help you find something specific, sir?" The voice belonged to a woman in her 60s, emerging from behind a towering armoire with a dustcloth in her hands. She had the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades surrounded by beautiful objects, her movements careful and reverent. "Just browsing, thank you," Sean replied. "Looking for something for my study, perhaps a desk accessory or interesting book, something with character." "Ah, you appreciate things with stories then," the woman said, her eyes lighting up with obvious pleasure. "I'm Margaret McKenna. This shop has been in my family for 4 generations, and I can tell you the history of nearly everything here." "Sean Connery, and I'd very much like to hear some of those stories." Margaret's face showed polite recognition rather than the usual excitement Sean had come to expect. "Mr. Connery, of course. My late husband was quite fond of your films. Please, feel free to explore. If anything catches your interest, I'll be happy to share its provenance." John continued his wandering through rooms filled with the detritus of lives once lived, pocket watches whose ticking had marked precious moments, wedding china that had celebrated golden anniversaries, photographs in silver frames showing faces full of hopes and dreams now relegated to history. But it was in the second-floor study that he encountered something unexpected. Seated in a leather wing chair near the window, reading what appeared to be a handwritten letter by the afternoon light, was a man roughly Sean's own age. He wore a well-tailored but worn tweed jacket, and his silver hair caught the light filtering through the mullioned windows. What struck Sean most forcefully was the profound sadness in the man's posture, shoulders curved inward as if protecting himself from additional pain. "I beg your pardon," Sean said softly. "I didn't realize this room was occupied." The man looked up with startled eyes that were clearly red from crying. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to monopolize the space. Margaret said I could sit here while I decided about some things." "Please don't let me disturb you. I was just admiring the collection." The man gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Actually, if you don't mind, I could use the company. I'm George Hartwell." "Sean Connery," Sean replied, settling into the offered seat. "Are you a collector as well?" George's laugh was hollow, tinged with pain. "Not exactly. I'm here to sell some family pieces, things that belong to my wife, Helen. She passed away 4 months ago, and I find myself unable to live surrounded by reminders of everything I've lost." John felt immediate sympathy for the man's obvious grief. "I'm very sorry for your loss. That must be an incredibly difficult decision to make." "It is," George said, holding up the letter he had been reading, "especially when I discovered this among her papers yesterday. A letter she wrote to me but never gave me, apparently intended for me to find after she was gone." "What does it say?" George looked directly at Sean with eyes full of confusion and pain. "That's what's making this so complicated. She wrote about each of these pieces, the china, the jewelry, the furniture we accumulated over 46 years of marriage. But instead of instructions for selling them or giving them away, she wrote about the memories attached to each one." John could see the internal struggle playing out across George's face. "For instance," George continued, consulting the letter, "she wrote about this tea service we bought in Prague on our honeymoon in 1976. I was planning to sell it because I never drink tea, never entertain, never use anything that requires more effort than a microwave. But Helen wrote about how she could still remember the excitement in my face when I insisted we buy it despite the expense, how proud I was to carry it home on 3 different trains and 2 buses. He was preserving the memory of your joy, not just her own." "Exactly. And she did this for dozens of items. The reading chair where she said I looked most like myself when I was absorbed in a good book. the silver picture frames because she loved how carefully I would polish them before displaying new photographs of our grandchildren. The art we collected together, not because either of us was particularly sophisticated, but because we both agreed on what made us happy to look at. George's voice grew thick with emotion as he continued. She wrote about these objects as if they were repositories of our life together, not just things we owned, but witnesses to who we were as a couple. John felt moved by Helen's posthumous gift to her husband. It's a remarkable love letter. It is, but it's also making it impossible for me to go through with my plan to sell everything and move into a smaller, simpler place. How can I sell the Prague tea service when Helen specifically wrote about how much joy it brought me to give it to her? What's stopping you from keeping the pieces that matter most? George set the letter on the small table between their chairs. Practical things mostly. I'm moving from a 4-bedroom house to a 2-bedroom flat. I simply don't have space for everything. But more than that, he paused, struggling to articulate something difficult. More than that, I'm afraid that keeping these things will trap me in the past, will make it impossible to build any kind of new life without Helen. I'm 69 years old, Sean. I have perhaps 15 or 20 good years left. Should I spend them surrounded by reminders of what I've lost? Or should I create space for new experiences, new relationships, new ways of being myself? Sean recognized the profound complexity of George's dilemma. That's an extraordinarily difficult balance to strike. It is, and Helen's letter, as beautiful as it is, has made the decision exponentially more complicated. She wrote about these objects as if they contain the essence of our marriage, as if selling them would somehow diminish what we had together. Do you think that's true? George considered the question seriously. I don't know. Part of me thinks our love exists in my memories, in the way her influence continues to shape how I see the world, in the habits and perspectives I developed because of 46 years with her. Those things aren't dependent on owning particular pieces of furniture or china patterns. And the other part of you? And the other part of me worries that without these tangible reminders, I'll gradually forget important details, the way she looked reading in that chair, the pride she took in using our good china for everyday meals, because life is too short to save things for special occasions, the conversations we had while polishing silver together on Sunday afternoons. John felt the weight of George's fear. You're afraid that the objects hold memories that might otherwise fade. Yes, and I'm afraid that Helen somehow knew this, that her letter was her way of ensuring I wouldn't lose the small, daily reminders of how good we were together. They sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, both men understanding that George was wrestling with one of the fundamental questions of grief: how to honor the past while remaining open to whatever future remained. George, Sean said carefully, may I ask you something? Please do. When Helen was alive, did she ever express concerns about being forgotten after her death? George's face softened with memory. Not about being forgotten entirely, but yes, she worried about the small things. She used to say that everyone would remember the big moments, our wedding, the births of our children, major anniversaries, but that the daily tenderness would fade. The way we said good morning to each other, our Saturday morning ritual of reading the newspaper together, how we always chose the same side of the bed in hotel rooms. This letter might be her way of preserving those details. I think so, but here's what's confusing me. Does preserving those details require keeping the objects associated with them? Or would I be honoring her memory more by integrating those lessons into whatever new life I build? John felt moved by the depth of George's consideration for Helen's wishes and his own future well-being. What if, Sean suggested, the choice isn't between keeping everything or selling everything? What if you could find a middle path that honors both Helen's insights and your practical needs? What kind of middle path? Well, what if you identified the pieces that truly function as repositories of irreplaceable memories, the ones Helen wrote about most meaningfully in her letter, and kept those while letting go of objects that serve more functional than emotional purposes? George picked up the letter and scanned it again. That's interesting. Looking at this again, I can see that she wrote much more extensively about some pieces than others. The reading chair gets 2 full paragraphs, while the dining room table merits only a sentence or two, which suggests that some objects held deeper emotional significance for her. Yes, and perhaps more importantly, she wrote about which pieces seemed to bring out the best in me. The chair where I looked content, the silver I polished with obvious pride, the art we chose together after long, happy conversations about what we found beautiful. John watched George's face as understanding began to dawn. You're thinking that maybe Helen's letter wasn't meant to convince you to keep everything, but to help you identify which pieces truly mattered to both of you. Exactly. She knew I'd need to downsize, knew I'd struggle with these decisions. Maybe this letter was her way of helping me choose wisely rather than just sentimentally. Hey, it sounds like the kind of thoughtful guidance a loving spouse would provide. George stood and walked to the window, looking out at Edinburgh's ancient streets while processing this new interpretation of his wife's final gift. You know what the most beautiful part of her letter is? George said, turning back to face Sean. What's that? She wrote about these objects as witnesses to our love, but she also wrote about them as tools for continuing to express love to grandchildren who would visit my new home, to friends who might be welcome for dinner, to whomever might share my remaining years. That she was giving you permission to create new memories while honoring the old ones. Yes, she wrote about the Prague tea service, not just as a reminder of our honeymoon, but as something I could use to welcome people into my life, to create new moments of hospitality and connection. George returned to his chair with obvious relief spreading across his features. I think I understand now what Helen was trying to tell me. She wasn't asking me to build a shrine to our marriage. She was helping me identify which pieces of our shared life could continue to generate joy and connection in whatever comes next. It really seems like a perfect balance between honoring the past and remaining open to the future. It does, and it means I can keep the pieces that truly matter. The reading chair, the Prague tea service, the silver frames for photographs, a few pieces of art that make me genuinely happy to see every day, while letting go of things that are beautiful but not essential to maintaining connection with what Helen and I built together. Margaret McKenna appeared at the top of the stairs, clearly checking on her unusual customer who had been sitting with family pieces for over 2 hours. Mr. Hartwell, she said gently, have you made any decisions about what you'd like us to evaluate? George looked at Sean with genuine gratitude before turning to Margaret. Yes, I have. I'd like to keep about a dozen pieces, ones that my wife specifically identified as meaningful in the letter she left for me. The rest, I think it's time to let them find new homes where they can create new memories for other families. As Margaret and George discussed the practical details of his decision, Sean felt profoundly moved by what he had witnessed. George had found a way to honor his wife's memory, not by clinging to objects, but by understanding the deeper message of her letter, that love creates meaning through connection, not possession. Dawn, George said as they prepared to part ways, thank you for listening to me work through this. I don't think I could have found clarity without someone to hear me process Helen's letter. Thank you for sharing it with me. Your wife sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, and I think she would approve of my decisions today. I'm keeping the pieces that will help me remember our daily tenderness while making space for whatever new experiences my remaining years might bring. As Sean left McKenna's Antiques that afternoon, carrying a small silver compass that had reminded him of his father's love of navigation, he realized that George and Helen Hartwell had given him an unexpected gift. They had shown him that the most meaningful objects in our lives aren't valuable because of their monetary worth, but because they serve as bridges between the love we've known and the love we might yet discover. 3 months later, Sean would receive an invitation written in careful script on elegant paper. George Hartwell requests the pleasure of your company for afternoon tea, served in the Prague tea service that has found new purpose in creating connections between old friends and new ones. It wasn't just browsing in an antique shop, it was the discovery that the most valuable things we can leave behind aren't objects, but wisdom about how to love forward while honoring what came before, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is permission to trust their own judgment about what's worth keeping and what's ready to be released.